It is possible to deer-proof your garden. You can't do it with gimmicks, and there's really only one method that works. If you try it, it's not entirely foolproof, but it can give you a great advantage over those deer. Join me as I discuss how to deer-proof your garden. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I have a deer problem. My house resides in the city, but there's lots of trees and hills and culverts and areas for deer to bed down in. In fact, when we first moved into this house, we actually had 10 to 12 deer that regularly bedded down in our backyard. And it's taken me a number of years to reach the point where they're pesky, but they're not the problem that they used to be. Let me begin by talking about the difference between deer-proof and deer-resistant. And many of the things that you find on the internet or in blogs or in books imply that by doing something that's deer-resistant, it's actually deer-proof. And that's a very common misconception, that if you use a spray to keep away deer, you're deer-proofing your yard. No, you're just making it resistant. These daffodils that are just starting to come up in my yard are deer-resistant. The deer typically don't like to eat daffodils, but these plants are not deer-proof. If they're hungry enough, deer will eat these daffodils. There are all kinds of methods for making your garden deer-resistant, and you're probably aware of many of them. Things like coyote or lion urine, or human hair, or just bars of Irish Spring soap. And I'll actually have another video in the future that discusses those things and what works and what doesn't. But as far as making your garden deer-proof, there's really only one method that works, and that's to actually keep the deer away from your plants. Some type of physical barrier so that the deer cannot eat or rub their antlers against your plants. I've visited many gardens, but I've only seen one garden that was specifically constructed to be deer-proof. It was in the state of Washington, and the gardener had fenced in a pretty large garden area with 10-foot tall chain link fencing and with mesh across the top so that deer couldn't possibly get in. And it sounded like a great idea to me at the time. Since then, however, I worked at the Galileo Garden and we had 10-foot tall chain link fencing. It was great for years, no deer problems at all, until some vandals actually cut a hole in the fence to get in. Right away, the deer knew that hole was there and they squeezed through it and devastated many of the plants, especially the young fruit trees. There are many less expensive ways to deer-proof your garden. You don't have to build a 10-foot tall chain link fence. But let's revisit that initial idea about deer-proofing. You do need to have a barrier between the deer and your plants. It can be simple, it can be big, but the barrier needs to be there. And it's not foolproof. That's why the deer were able to squeeze through the fencing. And you may have seen my video where I discuss why I like to garden. And behind my shoulder while I was talking, a small group of deer walked right into my backyard because I left the gate open. For everything I'm about to tell you, you gotta remember to always close the gate, or whatever method you're using. So let's walk through my landscape and my garden, and I'll show you how I've been able to deer-proof many of the plants in my landscape, but more importantly, how I've been able to deer-proof my vegetable garden. I have a wrap around this small maple tree just to help reduce some of the damage that deer caused in years past. And if you look, you can actually see this whole area that has split. But what initially caused this was from young bucks scraping their antlers against the bark of this tree. And so what I've done since then, in addition to wrapping the tree and trying to keep the split from getting larger, is to put a metal fence around the tree so they can no longer get in and rub their antlers. It actually took me a little while to recognize that the damage to my young maple was caused by deer. Let's go to my neighbor's yard where it's a little more obvious. Here's my neighbor's tree. You can see the damage that the deer did on this one, scraping their antlers. This has been 2 years and the bark just won't recover. Here's a different tree on my neighbor's property, and you can see again, just from rubbing their antlers, what kind of damage the deer will do. And the bark is gone. It'll never come back. So once I identified that deer were present in my landscape and destroying my trees, when I planted this tree a couple years after that young maple, I installed a nice barrier around it. It's still the same basic wire fencing, but it extends out about 5 to 6 feet all the way around the trunk. And I've had absolutely no problem with deer trying to get to the other side. And it's just far enough away from the trunk that they can't lean in and chew on any of the tips either. I put this area of fencing around this sumac, and I chose the sumac because it's supposedly deer resistant, but in the first year they were eating it almost to the ground, and I wanted the plant to at least get a little bit of growth on it, and this happened now because of this fencing that's around it. But now the deer can actually reach right in and chew off these tips if they want to. I'm going to wait and see if they want to. I may have to put a larger fence area around it like this other tree. I'm just going to have to wait and see. But this small area at least allowed the plant to get a start and establish its growth. This crabapple was one of the first trees I put in my landscape, and this fencing was one of the first that I did to try to deer-proof my yard. And it's been very effective. That's why I'm not so worried about the sumac, because even though the deer could reach in and gnaw off some of the tips of these branches, just by having this barrier here, it's been enough to cause them to walk in a different direction. And after 4 years now, I've yet to see any damage from deer on this tree. Now let's look at some of the concerns in the vegetable garden, and let's talk a little bit about how deer think and how they act. When they're just walking through my front yard, a fence around a tree is probably good enough to just keep them walking. It's easier for them to bend down and nibble on some grass or go to the neighbor's yard rather than go to work against a fence. But in the vegetable garden, there's a smorgasbord. It's a buffet of delicious treats for the deer, and they're going to want to get in here. So the barrier needs to be a little more substantial. At the back of our yard, we have this 6-foot high wooden fence, and it's been very effective against the deer. Our yard slopes slightly away, so the deer that are coming up the hill from this direction on the other side of the fence will see the fence and they can't see anything beyond it. And one of the interesting things about deer psychology, they're not going to jump any object unless they know that they can land on the other side safely. So even though a large deer could jump this 6-foot high fence, because they can't see the other side, they don't even make the attempt. This is the Achilles heel of my landscape. This fence is only 4 foot high. It's this mesh wire fencing, and deer can easily jump it. Now, my neighbor does have 6-foot high wooden fencing around most of the yard. But at the end of this short wire fence, there's a gap, just enough so deer can get into my neighbor's yard. And occasionally when a deer gets into my neighbor's yard, it'll jump this fence and come into my garden. So I need to have some very specific safeguards against the deer that make it this far. One of the first things that a deer will encounter in my garden is this young apple tree. So what I did is I sunk a post, put a crossbar at the top, and then I draped bird netting over the entire thing. And that bird netting is a barrier that keeps the deer from eating the delicious tips of this young tree. I just have a 5-foot high mesh wire fence on this section of the garden. But remember, they're looking for a safe spot to land. So just on the other side, I put little things like some garden art and a small hoop that holds bird netting over my strawberries. And this is enough to keep the deer from jumping this small fence and going to the other side. I use the same concept in this area of the garden. This little fence is only about 3 feet high, but directly on the other side, I have one of my tomato trellises. I have another low trellis, and even the bricks in this walkway will give the deer pause to wonder if they can jump this area and land safely. And so far, even though this is very small, I haven't had a problem, because you're not going to see deer step over a fence. They're going to jump over a fence. And so the barriers don't necessarily have to be the fence on the outside. It can be something on the inside that just stops them from wanting to jump. In this small section of the garden, there's no fence yet. But I do have a couple other types of barriers that seem to work. The raspberries are right here. The deer don't like to eat raspberries because of those prickly stickers. So they avoid it. This bed right here has garlic planted in it. They typically don't like garlic, so they'll avoid it and keep walking. Lily, come here. And then the barrier that tends to work best, come on, is Lily. If she's doing her job and she sees the deer in the yard, all it takes is a bark, and typically they're jumping back over my neighbor's fence, and the garden is safe. So really, the only way to deer-proof your garden is to have that barrier between the deer and your plants. Now you can use other methods, and that's what I referred to as gimmicks earlier, because many of those things that you buy or you see on the internet work, but only for a brief period of time. And then the deer get used to them, and it's no longer a deterrent. But when used in conjunction with the fencing or some other barrier, it can actually help make your garden more deer-proof. I use plant selection as a primary method. All the plants around these little fenced areas are plants that typically deer don't like to eat. So as they're roaming through looking for something to eat, they're not finding anything that they like. And then they bump up against one of these fences and they're thinking whatever's on the other side must taste the same. So they go on down the street. You can also use one of those temporary measures to achieve the same effect. Yes, if you put coyote urine outside one of these barriers, the deer will probably walk on down the street. You just want to try to establish a habit pattern for them to not want to eat your plants with this type of barrier or deer proofing. You may not think this fencing looks very attractive, and in some cases it's not. For me, I look at this sumac and this tree behind me, and I think one day they'll be big enough that I don't need this fencing anymore. For your smaller plants, you may need to always have bird netting or some type of barrier around it to keep the deer away. It all comes down to how well you can train your deer to go eat your neighbor's yard and not yours. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know below. If you'd like to see more of these videos, then subscribe to the Gardener Scott channel if you haven't already done so. If you like this video, you can give me a thumbs up and share it. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.